I can't see your face, but I can feel your heartbeat. You're trembling, but you're still standing between us and them." The words tore out of the young blind woman before she could stop them, her fingers clutching at rain-soaked fabric, thunder cracking overhead like artillery fire. The time was 11:44 p.m. on Halsted Street. The date was July 19th. What happened in the next 43 seconds would change everything. Allara Voss stood in a summer downpour so thick it blurred the streetlights into yellow halos that bled at the edges. Her orthopedic shoes were ankle-deep in rushing water. Her stained diner uniform, the one with the permanent coffee stain above the left pocket, was plastered to her shaking body like a second skin. Her dark hair hung in ropes down her back. Her brown eyes were wide and burning with something that looked like courage but felt like terror from the inside. 3 men with crowbars circled a young man on his knees. Blood streamed from his temple, mixing with rainwater, running into his mouth. His hands were raised in surrender. His body was already broken. Robert Hargrove stood 15 feet away with his collar turned up, watching with cold satisfaction. He was 58 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair like moonlight through contaminated water. His suit cost more than Allara made in 4 months. His shoes alone would pay her electric bill for a year. He stood with his weight balanced on his heels, his fists clenched, his face empty of all feeling except hunger. Behind Allara, pressed against the abandoned warehouse in trance, a blind Korean woman in her mid-20s held onto a man's arm. Her unseeing eyes were wide with terror. Her other hand was outstretched, searching for something to hold, finding only air. That man was Rafael Romano. He was 32 years old, 6'2", with shoulders that filled the doorway like something carved from stone. His hand was protective on his sister's shoulder, his entire body tense as a coiled spring about to release. And in that moment, Rafael Romano was frozen. For 3 months, he had been hunting Hargrove's crew. For 3 months, he had been waiting for them to cross into his territory, waiting for the moment when he could move without witnesses, without complications, without mercy. He had set the trap perfectly. The abandoned warehouse. The isolated street. Hargrove's nephew, the one who had been stealing from him, the one who needed to be taught what happens to thieves. And then she walked into it. This stranger. This woman in a stained apron and orthopedic shoes. This nobody who smelled like burnt coffee and desperation and something else he couldn't name. This waitress who had nothing, no weapon, no training, only the muscle memory of survival that came from being small and powerless in a world built for larger men. She stepped between the crowbars and the young man's bleeding skull. "He's down," Allara said. Her voice cut through the storm like something that refused to break. "You made your point. Let him go." Hargrove's men paused. They exchanged looks, confused by the audacity of this woman, this absolute nobody who had just interrupted their work. One of them laughed. It was a sound like gravel being dragged across concrete. "Who the hell are you?" or the man with the crowbar asked. He was built like a refrigerator with arms. His neck had no definition, just a pillar of muscle running straight from his shoulders to his jaw. "Someone who's asking you to stop," Allara said. The rain fell harder. It fell like punishment. It felt like the sky was breaking open and spilling all its grief onto the streets below. Hargrove stepped forward. His shoes made no sound on the wet concrete. He moved like a general surveying a battlefield, his eyes taking in the strange sight of this woman, this waitress who had just made the worst decision of her life. Or the best one. He didn't know yet which it would turn out to be. "Do you understand who I am?" he asked. His voice was soft. That was the terrifying part. It was soft like a knife being drawn from its sheath. "Do you understand what I am capable of?" "I understand that he's hurt," Allara said. "I understand that you've already won. I understand that killing him serves no purpose except proving you're afraid of something." Silence swallowed the warehouse entrance. Even the rain seemed to pause, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Rafael Romano had not moved. His hand was still on his sister's shoulder, but everything inside him had shifted into a state of pure focus. This woman was extraordinary. This woman was insane. This woman was about to die, and something in him was already screaming against it with an intensity that terrified him. Hargrove's smile was a wound opening. He raised his hand. The signal. The permission. The men with the crowbars stepped forward. But what she did not understand was that Rafael Romano could not let her die. That in that single moment, in that single decision to step between armed men and their prey, she had become something other than a stranger. She had become a mirror. She had become a reflection of the person he had promised his dying mother he would be, the person who protects the helpless even when protection costs everything. Rafael moved. He moved like something that had been waiting 15 years to move, like a coiled spring finally released, like a blade cutting through air. He emerged from the warehouse shadows with Sergio at his right hand and Sal at his left. Behind them, 4 more men appeared from the darkness. All in black. All moving in silence. All carrying the weight of Rafael Romano's law. Hargrove's crew froze. The young man with the bleeding temple looked up and understood immediately. He had been bait. The whole setup had been a trap designed to catch Hargrove's movement, to give Rafael Romano the excuse he needed to move against his enemy in the middle of the night. But Hargrove had walked into a different trap entirely. He had walked into a moment where a stranger had chosen courage over safety, and in doing so, she had changed everything. "Rafael," Hargrove said. His voice was no longer soft. It was sharp now, like broken glass. "This is between me and the boy. The boy is under my protection," Rafael said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. Like something that could not be broken. "And so is she." He looked at Allara for the first time. Really looked at her. Saw the trembling in her shoulders. Saw the defiance burning in her brown eyes. Saw the way her fists were clenched not from courage but from absolute terror that she was hiding behind every word. "What's your name?" he asked. "Allara," she whispered. The thunder rolled across the sky like drums announcing the beginning of a war. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to 3 days earlier, to 3:22 in the morning at Brennan's diner on the south side, where everything started. The checkered floor was black and white and everything in between, stained with 30 years of coffee spills and broken dreams. Allara Voss sat in the back office on a plastic chair with a broken wheel, counting the tips she had earned in the last 8 hours. She was 27 years old but looked 40. Her brown eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had not slept properly in 8 months. Her hands were calloused from double shifts, the skin cracked and raw at the knuckles. $34 lay in piles on the desk in front of her. $34. That was everything. That was rent for 1 week. That was food for 10 days if she was careful. That was gasoline to drive to the hospital where her sister Ava worked the night shift. That was her entire world, reduced to paper and metal that barely covered the essentials. The clock on the wall showed 3:22 a.m. Outside, the south side slept like something wounded, like something that had given up on healing. The diner was empty except for the manager, Marcus, who was smoking a cigarette by the front door even though smoking inside was illegal and he knew it and nobody cared. Allara had been working double shifts for 8 months. 8 months of coming in at 7 in the morning. 8 months of standing on her feet for 12 hours straight. 8 months of smiling at customers who stiffed her on tips and complained about their eggs and made comments about her body when they thought she couldn't hear them. She had been saving for her daughter's surgery. That surgery cost $150,000. The surgery was scheduled for October. That gave her 12 weeks. 12 weeks to somehow find $150,000 on a waitress salary and $34 in tips. The mathematics of it made her laugh, but she had stopped laughing around month 3. Ava was 5 years old. She had been born with a condition that made it hard for her to move her left side. The physical therapist said that with surgery, she could walk normally. Without it, she would limp for the rest of her life. She would be different. She would be marked. And Allara could not bear the thought of her daughter being marked by something she couldn't control, something she didn't choose. So Allara worked. She worked until her feet bled into her socks. She worked until her hands shook from exhaustion. She worked until her voice went hoarse from talking to strangers who treated her like she was furniture, like she was a thing that existed only to serve their needs and vanish. The rain started around 2 in the morning. It came down in sheets so thick Allara could barely see across the street through the diner windows. The kind of rain that made the power flicker. The kind of rain that felt like the sky was trying to wash something away, something that wouldn't wash. At 3:18 a.m., Brennan himself came into the office. He was the owner. He was also the worst human being Allara had ever met, which was saying something given the life she had lived. He was 64 years old, with a belly that hung over his belt and eyes that had no kindness in them. His breath always smelled like whiskey and cigarettes. He stood in the doorway and watched her count her tips. $34, he said. That's pitiful. It's what I made, Allara said without looking up. You know what your problem is? Brennan asked. His voice was the kind that made Allara's skin crawl. You got no personality. You don't smile enough. You got that desperate look on your face all the time and it makes people uncomfortable. They come to a diner to relax. They don't want to see someone's problems written all over their face. Allara did not respond. I'm thinking about bringing in someone younger, he continued. Someone prettier. Someone who knows how to work the customers. Someone who makes them want to come back. Still, Allara did not respond. She had learned that words only made it worse. That sometimes the only survival strategy was to become invisible, to make yourself so small and quiet that people forgot you were there. Did you hear me? Brennan asked. Yes, Allara said. Yes, what? Yes, I heard you. He stood there for another moment, and she could feel his eyes on her like something physical, like something that left marks. Then he left. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, and she was alone again with her $34 and the sound of rain hitting the windows like an accusation. At 3:22 a.m., as Allara was putting the money into a worn envelope, her phone buzzed. It was a text from the hospital. From the department where her sister worked. It was a photo. It showed a man in an expensive suit standing in the waiting room. Behind him were 6 other men, all dressed in black, all looking like they had stepped out of a nightmare. The man in the center had his hand on a young woman's shoulder. The young woman's eyes were closed. She was crying. The text said, "What happened to Maria? Why are these men here?" Maria was Allara's younger sister. She worked as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. The text had come from another nurse, someone Allara didn't know well. Someone who was scared. Allara's hand started to shake. She had no idea what was happening. She had no idea that 3 blocks away, in an abandoned warehouse on Halsted Street, something was about to set in motion a chain of events that would erase her old life completely. She did not know that within 3 days, she would be standing between armed men and their victim in the middle of a summer storm. She did not know that in doing so, she would catch the attention of the most dangerous man in Chicago. She only knew that her sister was in trouble. That her sister needed her. That everything else, the $34, the surgery Ava needed, the tips that would not come, would have to wait. She grabbed her coat. She ran into the rain. The fluorescent lights of Brennan's diner buzzed like dying insects in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound had become so familiar to Allara Voss that she no longer heard it, the same way she no longer heard the sticky squelch of her orthopedic shoes on the checkered linoleum, or the industrial fan that rattled against the back wall like something broken and refusing to accept it. The only sound that mattered now was the sound of coins hitting the Formica counter. $34. She spread the crumpled bills and coins across the counter with trembling fingers, arranging them like a map of a life stretched too thin. 5 ones, 8 fives, 2 tens, and $14 in coins scattered across the worn surface. $34. That was her tip money for a 14-hour shift. 14 hours of smiling at men who would not look her in the eye. 14 hours of refilling coffee cups, wiping down tables, listening to conversations about vacation homes and stock portfolios while her daughter's asthma inhaler cost $150 every single week. The wall clock above the kitchen read 3:22 a.m. 3 hours and 41 minutes until she was supposed to be back. Lou Brennan appeared from the kitchen, moving with the slouch of a man who had owned this diner for 32 years and regretted most of them. He was 63 years old, with a belly that hung over his belt and hair that had turned completely gray sometime during the Bush administration. He did not look at Allara. He looked at the money on the counter. "Another double tomorrow?" he asked. She was already tying the bills with a rubber band, her movements practiced and efficient. The rubber band was the same one she had used yesterday and the day before that. The edges were fraying. She did not answer his question because they both knew the answer. She nodded without looking up. "Need the hours," she said. Lou grunted something that might have been sympathy or might have been judgment. With Lou, it was always impossible to tell. He shuffled back into the kitchen, his shoes leaving wet prints on the linoleum. It had been raining outside for the last 6 hours. Hard rain. The kind of rain that made the city smell like copper and rust. Allara looked at the $34 in her hands. 8 months. She had been working double shifts for 8 months straight. 8 months of 3 a.m. mornings and midnight closures. 8 months of eating the leftover hash browns from the lunch rush, the ones that were cold and congealed and tasted like failure. 8 months of watching her body move through space without quite believing it was still hers. She was 27 years old, but the mirror had started showing her a woman of 40. Dark circles like purple bruises. Hands that shook from exhaustion. Hair that had lost its shine somewhere around month 3. The money was for her daughter. Ava was 6 years old and had asthma. Not the manageable kind. The kind that sent her to the hospital 3 times last year. The kind that made Allara wake up at night listening for the sound of her breathing, terrified that one night she would not hear it at all. The inhaler cost $150 a month. The doctor visits cost another $100. The apartment they lived in, the studio above the Lucky Laundromat on Halsted Street, cost $750 a month. The walls sweated in summer. The windows froze solid in winter. Water dripped from the ceiling in at least 4 different locations depending on where it had rained. But it was what she could afford. It was what she could afford on 70 hours a week of waitressing at Brennan's diner. She slipped the $34 into a worn envelope and tucked it into her apron pocket. The walk home took 23 minutes if she went fast. If she took the long way around, avoiding the warehouses on Halsted Street, it took 31 minutes. The neighborhood was not safe at night. The neighborhood was not safe during the day. But safety was a luxury. Allara could not afford luxury. She could afford orthopedic shoes from a discount store and bus fare and coffee that she made at home instead of buying it out. She clocked out at 3:45 a.m. The assistant manager, a woman named Chen who had worked at Brennan's for longer than Allara had been alive, did not say goodbye. She never said goodbye. She just watched Allara disappear into the night with the same expression someone might watch a ghost. The pre-dawn air was thick and muggy. Summer had wrapped itself around Chicago like a fist. The weather forecast had been calling for a storm all week, but the sky had remained stubbornly clear until tonight. Now, as Allara walked, she could feel the humidity in her lungs. She could feel the air changing. The pressure dropping. The storm was coming. The kind of storm that turned streets into rivers. The kind of storm that made the city reveal what it really was, dangerous and drowning and indifferent to the people struggling to survive within it. She stopped on the corner of Madison and Jefferson to help an elderly man who had dropped his groceries. He was maybe 75. His hands shook as he bent down to pick up oranges that had rolled across the sidewalk. Allara crouched beside him without thinking. She was dead on her feet. She had been awake for 20 hours. But she helped him anyway. She picked up the oranges. She put them back in his bags. He thanked her with tears in his eyes, actually cried while thanking her for this small thing, this nothing thing, and Allara understood that this man was also drowning, that gratitude was drowning, that kindness was drowning. 3 blocks from her apartment, she passed a convenience store that was open 24 hours. A stray dog lay shivering in the doorway, its ribs visible like a cage of bones. Allara went inside. She spent $2 from her carefully counted 34 on a package of hot dogs. She came back outside and split the last one with the dog, sitting on the wet sidewalk in her Brennan's diner uniform, the fabric clinging to her skin. "Someone will help you," she whispered to the dog. "Someone has to help you." But she knew better. She knew that help was something people like her and this dog talked about in theory, in the stories they told themselves when the real weight of the world became too much to bear. By the time she reached Halsted Street, the storm had begun in earnest. It was 11:34 p.m. on the 3rd day since the photograph had arrived. The 3rd day since her phone had buzzed with an image of men in black suits and her sister Maria's tears. She had gone to the hospital the moment she saw the photo. She had found Maria in the maternity ward, pale and trembling, working her shift like nothing had happened. When Allara had asked what the men wanted, Maria had said only one word. Rafael. That name meant something in Chicago. That name meant the kind of power that did not advertise itself. The kind of power that moved through the city like a blade through water, leaving no ripples. The rain came sideways now, driven by a wind that felt like it had teeth. The lightning was so bright it erased the shadows from the streets. For a moment, Allara could see everything. For a moment, the entire city was illuminated in shades of white and silver. Then the thunder came, not a sound but a physical force that seemed to shake the ground itself. She could have taken the long way around. She could have walked an extra 8 minutes to avoid the warehouses. But her feet hurt. Her body hurt. Her heart hurt from a weariness that went deeper than mere exhaustion. She cut through the shortcut past the abandoned building on Halsted. The building had not been in use for years. Years before that, it had been a printing factory. Now it was just a skeleton of red brick and broken windows and the kind of darkness that made you believe that the world had ended and you were the only person who had not received the notification. It was there, at 11:16 p.m., that she heard the screaming. It was the sound of a human voice at its absolute breaking point. Raw. Desperate. The kind of scream that meant someone was not just afraid but convinced they were about to die. The sound cut through the thunder like a blade wrapped in ice. Every instinct told Allara to run. To keep walking. To pretend she had heard nothing. The streets of Chicago had taught her 1,000 times that people who stopped to help became victims themselves. People who paid attention to the suffering of strangers only multiplied their own suffering. This was the first law of the city. This was the law written in blood and heartbreak. But Allara was not the law. Allara was someone who gave her last hot dog to a dying dog on the sidewalk. Allara was someone who helped old men pick up oranges even though she had been awake for 20 hours. She stopped walking. The screaming came from the warehouse. From around the corner. She crept forward until she could see. There was a young man in the gravel lot behind the warehouse. He was on his knees. He was maybe 23 years old, with dark hair plastered to his forehead with blood and rain. His face was already swollen beyond recognition. His hands were raised in a gesture of surrender. Around him in a circle stood 3 men with crowbars. They wore suits despite the rain. Their suits probably cost more than everything Allara owned. Everything she had ever owned. Everything she would own if she worked for another 10 years. Behind them stood Robert Hargrove. Hargrove was 61 years old and had the kind of face that had been soaked in cruelty so long the cruelty had become his baseline expression. He was tall. 6'2". He wore a charcoal suit that was tailored to his broad shoulders, and the rain slid off it like water off oiled canvas. His hair was silver. His eyes were the color of a winter sky. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the young man beg for his life with the kind of detached interest someone might have watching paint dry. "Please," the young man was saying. Please, I will pay it back. I will get you the money. Just give me 3 weeks. Just give me. Hargrove did not speak. He simply nodded to the man on his right. The man raised his crowbar. It was then that Allara saw the warehouse entrance. There was a figure standing in the darkness of the open door. A young woman. She was maybe 25, 26 years old, and she was crying silently. Her hand was on the shoulder of another figure, a man, tall and broad and moving with the kind of controlled grace that came from someone who had been trained in violence the way other people were trained in mathematics. The young woman's eyes were moving back and forth, searching for light but never quite finding it. She was blind. The man beside her kept his hand on her shoulder, steady and present, and Allara understood that he was trying to comfort her. That he was keeping her from falling apart completely. That he cared about this woman the way someone cares about something precious and breakable. The crowbar was coming down. Allara did not think. She had learned a long time ago that thinking was a luxury for people who could afford hesitation. She stepped into the light. "He's down," she said. Her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. "You made your point. Let him go." The 3 men with crowbars turned to look at her. The young man on his knees looked at her with an expression of such complete shock it was as if an angel had materialized out of the rain. Robert Hargrove looked at her like she was something he had discovered on the bottom of his shoe. The crowbar hung suspended in the rain like a blade about to fall, and in that frozen moment between one breath and the next, Allara Voss stepped forward. Her shoe squelched in the water pooling around the young man's knees. Her apron, stained with coffee and something that might have been gravy, clung to her ribs. She was soaking wet, shaking, and she was between them anyway. "He's down," she said. Her voice did not shake. "You made your point. Let him go." The 3 men with crowbars turned in unison, their expression cycling from shock to confusion to something that looked almost like amusement. One of them laughed, a sound like gravel in a throat. "Lady, you lost? This is nobody's business but ours." Robert Hargrove did not laugh. He stood perhaps 20 feet away, his collar turned up against the downpour, his suit jacket soaked through with rain that turned the charcoal fabric almost black. He was 58 years old with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, with a scar that ran from the outer corner of his left eye down to his jaw like a permanent reminder that he had once lost a fight. He did not lose fights anymore. His hands were still clenched, but now they unclenched slowly, deliberately, the way a man unclenches his fists when he decides violence is unnecessary because fear will accomplish the same thing. He studied Allara with an expression like a collector examining a piece he might add to his gallery. "You know who I am?" he asked. She shook her head. Water ran from her hair down the side of her face. "You know who you just embarrassed in front of my crew?" Another shake. Her chin came up just slightly. Hargrove smiled without warmth. It was the kind of smile that had made grown men confess crimes they did not commit, that had convinced accountants to steal from their own families, that had somehow convinced 3 armed men to lower their crowbars and step back into the rain like they had been given an order spoken too quietly for anyone else to hear. "You're brave or stupid," Hargrove said. "Either way, I'll remember your face." He turned and walked back toward the street, his men flanking him, and within 30 seconds the sound of car doors closing and an engine rumbling to life faded into the sound of the rain again. The young man scrambled to his feet and ran without saying a word, without even looking back at the woman who had saved his life, his footsteps echoing away into the darkness. And Allara was alone. She stood in the downpour with her whole body beginning to shake, not from cold but from the delayed arrival of fear. Her hands came up to her face. Her shoulders folded forward. She did not cry, her tears had dried up somewhere on a Greyhound bus 3 years ago, but her breath came in short, sharp gasps like she was drowning even though the water was only at her ankles. What she did not see was the figure standing in the warehouse entrance 15 feet behind her. Rafael Romano was 29 years old with the kind of face that belonged in a Renaissance painting if it had not been marked by violence. His hair was dark and perfectly maintained. His eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that somehow remained nearly dry even in the downpour because he moved like a man who understood the physics of water and light and how to navigate the world without disturbing it. His left hand rested on the shoulder of a young woman standing beside him. That young woman's name was Eva Romano. She was 24 years old, and her eyes did not focus on anything because there was nothing for them to focus on. A car accident when she was 16 had taken her sight and had taken their mother's life in the same collision that lasted approximately 2.3 seconds. 8 years had passed since then. 8 years of her brother keeping the entire Romano family empire running with one hand while keeping her safe with the other. Ava's eyes were moving slightly, searching for light that never quite resolved into anything her brain could process. Her hand gripped her brother's arm like he was the only solid thing in a world of water and shadows. Oppa, who was that? She whispered in Korean, using the word for older brother that she had spoken since she was 5 years old and had first understood that he would always protect her, always be the one to keep her from falling. Rafael did not answer immediately. In 15 years of running the Romano family, he had never seen anything quite like what he had just witnessed. This woman, soaked, exhausted, carrying the kind of weariness that came from surviving impossible circumstances, had stepped between armed men and their violence without a weapon, without backup, without even knowing the stakes. She had known only that someone was hurt and that she could not allow it to continue. That kind of courage did not exist in his world anymore. If it ever had. "Come on," he said finally to Ava. "Let's get you inside." He kept his hand on her shoulder and guided her back into the warehouse, but he kept his eyes on the empty street where Allara was disappearing into the rain, her silhouette becoming fainter with each step until she was nothing but another shadow being swallowed by the storm. Sergio emerged from the deeper darkness, his phone already in his hand. Sergio had worked for Rafael for 11 years and had learned to read his boss's face the way other men read books. Something had changed just now. Something had shifted on its axis. "Boss, should we follow her? Should we make a move?" Rafael watched the last of Allara's shadow disappear around a corner 2 blocks away. "Find out everything. Her name. Where she works. Where she lives. Everything. But don't approach. Not yet. I want to know who she is before any of this goes further." "Who is she?" Sergio asked. Rafael turned away from the window, and when he did, his hand was still on Ava's shoulder, steady and present, keeping her tethered to the world she could not see. "Someone who doesn't know she just became a target," he said quietly. For days passed. For days of Allara returning to Brennan's diner on the south side, a place so old that the vinyl booths were cracked along the seams and the clock on the wall had been stuck at 3:15 for 6 months. The owner, a man named Harold Brennan who was 62 and who had not smiled in the entire 7 years Allara had worked for him, let her keep the job because she never complained and never asked for favors and showed up even when she was sick enough that she should have been in a hospital bed instead of standing 8 hours on legs that shook with fever. On the 4th day, at 2:15 in the afternoon, the bell above the door chimed and the atmosphere of the diner shifted like a pressure change before a storm. Victoria Ashford walked in with the kind of presence that made it clear she had never worked a double shift in her entire life. She was 53 years old and wore a cream Chanel suit that cost more than Allara made in 6 months. A diamond tennis bracelet caught the light on her left wrist, throwing fractured rainbows across the cracked vinyl booth where she sat down without waiting to be seated. Her nephew followed behind her like a shadow that had learned to walk on 2 legs. That nephew was Connor Ashford. 28 years old with slicked-back hair, designer jeans, and the particular kind of entitlement that came from being born into money that other people had earned through violence. He slid into the booth across from his aunt and his eyes found Allara immediately. He did not look away. Allara had learned a long time ago to recognize the difference between a man's gaze and a predator's stare. This was a predator's stare. She kept her hand steady as she approached the table. "What can I get for you?" Victoria snapped her fingers without looking up from the menu. "Coffee. Black. And make it quick. We don't have all day for you people." "You people." As if Allara belonged to a different species entirely. Allara poured the coffee and set it down carefully, professionally, every movement economical and controlled. Connor picked up his cup without drinking from it and continued watching her like she was a problem he was trying to solve. "You work here every day?" he asked. "Most days." "What time do you get off?" Something cold moved down Allara's spine. "Why?" "Just curious about a girl who thinks she can play hero." The coffee pot slipped a fraction of an inch in her grip. "I don't know what you're talking about." Connor smiled. It was not a warm smile. "You stepped between my uncle and his business for nights ago. Interfered with a transaction. That was incredibly unwise." Allara set the coffee pot down on the table with deliberate care. "I saw someone getting hurt. I stopped it. That's all." Victoria finally looked up from her menu, and her expression could have frozen a lake. "My brother Robert mentioned you to me. He was quite impressed, actually. Impressed by your stupidity. You don't embarrass one of the most dangerous men in Chicago without consequences." She slid a business card across the table. The card was embossed in gold lettering. An address was written on the back in fountain pen. "Tonight. 9 p.m. Underground poker room on West Madison. My nephew has a game there, and he would like you to serve drinks. Consider it community service." "I work until 11, Allara said. "Not anymore, you don't." Victoria smiled without warmth. "I just completed the purchase of this diner, including all existing staff and all outstanding debts associated with this property. You work for me now. 9 p.m., or you're fired and I make sure you never work in Chicago again. I have the resources to make that happen." Allara's hands began to shake. She could not afford to lose this job. She could not afford anything at all. That evening at 6:30, Allara stood in front of her apartment mirror in a black dress she had bought at a Goodwill for $5. The dress hung on her frame like it had been tailored for someone larger, someone who had the luxury of having weight to carry. She fixed her hair and told her daughter, a girl of 6 years old named Luna with dark eyes and asthma that required 3 different medications, that she would be working late. Luna sat on the bed coloring a picture. "Will you be home for breakfast?" "I will try very hard," Allara said. Luna handed her the drawing. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with yellow windows. Allara was the tallest. Luna was second tallest. The other 2 figures were drawn with no faces, just empty circles where faces should be. "These are the people we're waiting for," Luna said. "The people who are going to make our family whole again." Allara folded the drawing and put it in her pocket, keeping it close to her heart the way some people keep prayers. The underground poker room was accessed through an unmarked door in an alley on West Madison. 2 armed guards in dark suits stood on either side of the entrance, cigars burning like small fires in their mouths. They did not ask for ID. They simply nodded and opened the door. Inside was a world completely separate from the one Allara knew. The ceiling was low, painted black, and packed with expensive lighting that threw the green felt poker tables into sharp relief. Stacks of cash sat in neat piles, hundreds and thousands of dollars arranged like careful architecture. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the sound of chips clicking together as hands were dealt and fate was decided by probability and lies. Connor Ashford sat at the center table with 3 other men, and when he saw Allara, he waved her over with the casual cruelty of someone who has never been told no. "There she is," he said. "My lucky charm. Come here, sweetheart, make me some luck." She served drinks for 2 hours. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned. Connor's eyes never left her body, tracking her movements like a predator tracking prey, like he was counting the ways he could hurt her and deciding which would be most enjoyable. At 9:47 p.m., Connor lost a hand. He had been drinking. His judgment was impaired, but his hands were still large and still capable of causing damage. He grabbed her wrist as she moved past his table. His fingers dug in hard enough that she knew there would be bruises shaped like crescents tomorrow. "I asked you a question 3 hours ago," he said. His breath smelled like whiskey and cigarettes and something rotten underneath. "What's your number?" How much would it take to make you disappear with me? Please let go, Allara said quietly. How much? 10,000? 20. His grip tightened. Or are you the type that comes cheap? Are you the type that? The room went silent. The door had opened, and Rafael Romano walked through it with two men flanking him like human walls. Sergio and Sal moved with him as if they shared the same skeleton, the same impulses, the same code. Every man at every table looked up and then immediately looked down again, the way people look away from lightning. Rafael was dressed in a black suit that fit his frame like it had been created for his exact proportions. His shirt was open at the collar. He wore no jewelry. He did not need jewelry. His presence was jewelry enough, was statement enough, was threat enough. His eye swept the room and landed on Allara with a recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. He had seen her before. She understood this in the way his gaze held hers for a fraction longer than it needed to, in the way something shifted in his expression when he realized she was there. Connor released her wrist immediately. Some part of his alcohol-soaked brain recognized that whatever joke he was making had just stopped being funny. Rafael moved to a private table in the corner, and his eyes did not look away from Allara for the remaining 3 minutes. She stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe, understanding that the man with the storm-colored eyes was watching her the way a man watches something precious and impossible and dangerous all at once. At 11:43 p.m., the poker game broke up. Connor waited until Allara was cleaning the glasses, until she thought he had forgotten about her or lost interest, until she stepped outside into the alley where the humidity hung so thick it felt like drowning in the air. That was when he grabbed her from behind, his arm wrapping around her throat, slamming her backward against the brick wall so hard she heard something crack, though whether it was the wall or her spine she could not immediately determine. "You think you're too good for me?" His voice was hot against her ear, whiskey-soaked and vicious. "You think you can humiliate my family and walk away? You think some waitress with nothing gets to say no to me?" She tried to scream. His arm tightened around her throat and the sound died before it could leave her body. She drove her elbow backward as hard as she could and felt it connect with something soft. He grunted but did not release her. He hit her instead, his fist connecting with her ribs so hard the world went grey around the edges. He hit her again. Her vision tunneled. Stars appeared in the darkness. Then, a voice like winter, "Step away from her. Now." Rafael Romano stood at the mouth of the alley, and Connor released her immediately like he had been burned. Allara collapsed to the wet pavement, gasping, her vision swimming, one eye already swelling shut, her throat screaming with pain where his fingers had pressed. Connor turned with false bravado, wiping blood from his nose. "This is none of your business, Romano. You're in my territory. You put your hands on her. That makes it my business. What, you protecting waitresses now?" Connor's laugh was panicked, trying to sound casual. "She's nobody. Just some broke bitch who..." Sergio moved like lightning. His fist connected with Connor's nose and there was a sound like something breaking, wet and final. Connor staggered backward, blood streaming down his face, his hand flying to his nose. "My uncle will hear about this," he gasped. Rafael stepped closer, and something in his eyes made even Connor's entitled arrogance crumble like paper. "Tell your uncle that if he wants war, I'm ready. But this woman? She's under my protection now. You touch her again and I'll bury you next to your father." Connor ran. Rafael crouched beside Allara, careful to maintain distance, careful to move slowly so as not to frighten her further. In 15 years of running the Romano family, Sergio and Sal had never heard their boss speak in the voice he used now, gentle, careful, like he was soothing a frightened animal. "Can you stand?" Rafael asked. Allara tried. Her legs would not obey. The ground tilted beneath her. Rafael lifted her carefully, mindful of where she had been struck, supporting her weight against his chest. She could smell expensive cologne and expensive soap and something underneath that was purely him, something like steel and rain. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said. "I don't even know you," she whispered through her split lip. "I know," But you know my sister. The blind woman in the warehouse. That was Ava. You protected her without knowing who she was or who I was. You just saw someone vulnerable and acted. Now I'm returning the favor. His black SUV was parked at the end of the alley, engine running, doors unlocked. Sergio opened the back door and Rafael settled Allara onto the leather seat with careful movements. The vehicle smelled like new leather and pine air freshener. The seats were warm. The air conditioning was perfect. It felt like the safest place she had ever been. The drive to Rafael's penthouse took 17 minutes. It was located in a building with white stone facade on North Lakeshore Drive, offering views of the city that stretched for miles in every direction. The penthouse was on the 42nd floor. The elevator rose with the sound of expensive machinery operating at maximum efficiency. When the doors opened, Allara stepped into a world that belonged to someone else entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed Chicago spread out below like a kingdom. The furniture was minimalist: white leather sofa, glass and steel tables, abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. Everything was clean. Everything was organized. Everything was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, which is to say, in a way that excludes people like her. A private doctor was waiting. He tended to her injuries with professional efficiency and made no judgments about the bruises blooming across her ribs, about the handprints on her throat, about the swelling eye that would keep her from seeing properly for at least a week. Cracked rib. Severe bruising. Possible concussion. He prescribed painkillers and left a number in case anything worsened. And then Allara was alone with Rafael in his penthouse at 1 a.m, with the city sprawled below them like diamonds scattered on black velvet, with his expression unreadable and his eyes fixed on her like she was a puzzle he could not solve. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Her voice sounded destroyed. "I'm nobody. Just a waitress with $34 to my name and a daughter who needs medications I can't afford." Rafael sat across from her, careful to maintain distance. "You want the truth." His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "Because you're the first person in 10 years who's acted without calculating the cost. Everyone in my world makes moves based on what they can gain or avoid losing. You saw someone in danger and stepped in without knowing who they were, without knowing the consequences. That kind of courage doesn't exist anymore." "It was stupid," Allara said. "Maybe. But you did it anyway." He paused. "How much do you need?" "What?" "For your daughter's treatments. For your rent. For your life. How much would it take to make this bearable?" Alara's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I can't take your money. I don't want to owe you. You don't owe me." Rafael stood and walked to a desk made of dark wood. He opened a drawer. Inside were checkbooks. His handwriting was precise as he filled one out. "You saved my sister. That debt is mine to pay, not yours." He handed her the check. It was written for $50,000. Allara stared at it. The numbers seemed impossible, like numbers from a dream. "I can't accept this." "Then consider it payment for a job," Rafael said. "My sister Ava needs a companion. Someone to help her navigate the city. Someone to be her friend. She's been isolated since the accident. She needs someone who understands that vulnerability and strength exist in the same person. You understand that?" "Why me?" Alara's voice cracked. "Because when you saw her scared and blind in that warehouse, you didn't know who she was or who I was, and you protected her anyway. That's what she needs. Someone who acts from the heart instead of from fear." He paused. "Will you do it?" Allara looked at the check. $50,000. Enough to pay Luna's medical bills. Enough to catch up on rent. Enough to breathe for the first time in 3 years. She looked up at Rafael Romano, this man who had violence written into every line of his body, and she understood that by accepting this check, by coming into his world, she was crossing a line she would never be able to uncross. She folded the check and put it in her pocket next to Luna's drawing. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." The factory floor stretched empty and cold beneath the single overhead light, casting shadows that seemed to move with their own terrible intention. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a rhythm like a countdown. Allara sat tied to a metal chair, her wrists already bleeding from the rope, her breath coming in short gasps that echoed off the concrete walls. Connor Ashford paced in front of her, a cigarette burning between his fingers, his face twisted with an ugliness that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with the cruelty living inside him. "You know what happens next." Connor's voice was a sneer wrapped in casual menace. "After we deal with Rafael, I'm going to visit a little girl. 6 years old. Lives with Mrs. Chen on Ashland Avenue. That's Luna, right? Your daughter?" Allara's entire body went rigid. The ropes bit deeper into her wrists as she pulled against them, a sound like an animal caught in a trap escaping her throat. "Don't you dare. If you touch her, I swear." "You swear what?" Victoria Ashford sat in a folding chair like a woman presiding over a courtroom, her cream-colored suit immaculate, her expression devoid of mercy. "You'll what, exactly?" "You're tied to a chair in an abandoned factory with no one coming to save you. This is what happens when little waitresses forget their place in the world." Connor stubbed his cigarette out on the concrete floor near Allara's feet, the ash scattering like dirty snow. "Make the call," Victoria commanded, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. They forced the phone to her ear. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely hold it. Rafael answered before the first ring finished, his voice sharp with urgency. "Allara." She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to find courage in the same place it came from that night in the rain, but fear for her daughter drowned everything else. Her voice cracked like breaking glass. "They have me. Connor and Victoria. The factory on South Halstead. They want you alone or—" Connor snatched the phone from her hand, cutting off her words like a blade through silk. "1 hour. Come alone or she dies screaming. You have my word on that." He hung up. The sound of the dead line felt like a coffin lid closing. Allara collapsed against the chair, tears streaming down her face, not for herself but for Luna, for Ava who would lose another person she'd learned to trust, for Rafael walking into a trap because of her. The factory seemed to swallow every sound except for the dripping water and Connor's footsteps circling her like a predator sizing up prey. 30 minutes passed. Then 40. Then 52. At exactly 58 minutes, the sound changed. Car engines. Multiple vehicles. The rumble grew louder, closer, organized. Connor's head snapped toward the window. Victoria stood abruptly, her composure fracturing at the edges. What Connor saw through that grimy glass made all the color drain from his face. Outside, 12 black SUVs had arranged themselves in a perfect perimeter, each one military precise in its positioning. Men in tactical gear moved through the darkness like ghosts, professional, terrifying, armed with everything short of military hardware. Rafael Romano stood in the center, flanked by Sergio and Sal, his cashmere coat collar turned up against the November wind. 30 men surrounded the factory. Not the 8 or 10 Connor had expected. 30. Rafael's voice carried across the lot through a speaker system, amplified and impossible to ignore. "Connor Ashford. Victoria Ashford. Send her out unharmed. You have 10 seconds. Connor panicked, his survival instinct overriding every rational thought. He grabbed Allara, hauled her to her feet, pressed a gun against her temple with a hand that was shaking so badly the barrel rattled against her skull. "I'll kill her. I swear I'll do it." The factory side door exploded inward. The sound was deafening, metal screaming as the hinges tore free. Sergio and 4 men moved with the precision of a Swiss watch, disarming Connor before he could process what was happening. The gun fell from his hands. Sal pinned Victoria against the concrete wall with one hand, her face pressed hard enough to scrape skin away. Rafael walked through the dust and settling debris slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. His expression was utterly empty, the face of a man who had turned off every human emotion except one, the need to protect. He looked at Allara. One eye swollen shut again. Blood dried on her cheekbone from where Connor's ring had caught her. Handprint bruises dark as thunder marks on her throat. The cut along her collarbone had reopened, bleeding fresh red onto her waitress uniform, the one she'd been wearing when Connor dragged her into that car. Something in Rafael's eyes went dead and cold, like a candle being snuffed out. He crouched in front of Connor, who was now on his knees, trembling like a cornered animal, his entire body shaking with the knowledge of what was coming. "You threatened her daughter." Rafael's voice was soft, almost gentle. "You put your hands on her twice. You thought you could use her to hurt me." Connor babbled, the words pouring out like water from a broken pipe. "Please, please, I'm sorry. My uncle will pay you whatever you want. Please don't kill me, I'm begging you." "Kill you?" Rafael stood slowly. "No. Death would be too quick, too easy, too merciful for someone who threatened a child." He gestured to Sergio with a single movement of his hand. "Take them both into federal custody. I have friends at the FBI who've been building a RICO case against the Hargrove family for 3 years. Connor and Victoria just became their star witnesses, whether they cooperate or not." Victoria screamed, her composure shattering like dropped glass. "You can't do this. I have lawyers, I have money, my family has connections." "You had money," Rafael said quietly. "By morning, every account will be frozen. Every asset seized. Every property transferred. The evidence is airtight: drug trafficking, racketeering, murder conspiracy. Connor, you're looking at 40 years mandatory minimum. Victoria, as the family matriarch, you'll get life without parole." Sergio dragged Connor away, the young man sobbing and begging incoherently. Sal escorted Victoria out in handcuffs, her cream suit filthy, her perfectly maintained appearance demolished. The sound of their screaming faded as the factory emptied, until it was just Rafael and Allara. He moved toward her slowly, like approaching something frightened that might shatter. His hands that had ordered violence and built empires, were gentle as he untied the rope from her wrists. Where the fibers had cut into her skin, blood had dried dark. He didn't speak, just worked methodically, carefully, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle moving beneath his skin. "Can you walk?" His voice was barely above a whisper. She nodded, though her legs trembled as she stood. "Did they hurt you badly?" "Not as badly as they wanted to." He helped her to her feet, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not the controlled menace he wore like armor. Fear. Genuine, desperate fear, and not for himself but for her. It transformed his entire face, stripped away years of hardness, revealed the 17-year-old boy who had watched his father murdered from inside a closet and sworn to build a wall no one could ever break through. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I brought you into my world. I made you a target. That was selfish. You saved my life. Twice now. Because you saved my sister. Because you stood in the rain with nothing but courage and stopped men who should have terrified you. Because—" He stopped, struggling with words his mouth had never learned to shape, words his heart had never learned to believe were safe to speak. "Because you matter, Allara. Not as a companion for Ava. Not as payment for a debt. You matter as you. As this person who walks into darkness without a weapon and somehow becomes the strongest person in the room." Outside, the November wind howled across the empty lot where 12 black SUVs waited like mechanical sentinels. The sound was lonesome and cold, the sound of a world being reordered, of futures being remade, of a woman who had been nobody finally becoming everything. 2 weeks had passed since the night Rafael pulled Allara from that warehouse, since the rope fell away from her wrists and the blood dried dark against her skin. The November wind still howled outside the penthouse, but here, in these quiet rooms suspended above Chicago, the storm felt distant. Safe. A world away from the streets where she'd counted $34 in tips while her daughter waited for her to come home. Sunday morning arrived pale and cold. 9:15 on the kitchen clock. Lily sat at the marble island, her 6-year-old legs swinging beneath her, syrup coating her chin as she worked through a stack of pancakes Allara had made an hour earlier. The kitchen smelled like butter and vanilla and something Allara had almost forgotten existed: peace. She poured coffee into a white cup, watching her daughter's small hands grip the fork like she'd never eaten anything so good in her life. Footsteps approached from the east corridor. Heavy, measured, deliberate. Allara didn't turn, but she felt the shift in the air. Rafael always moved like a general surveying a battlefield, each step calculated, each movement purposeful. Lily looked up, syrup-sticky fingers pausing mid-bite. "Are you Mr. Rafael?" Her voice was small but without fear, the way children speak to people they've already decided are safe. He stopped in the doorway, a man whose shoulders filled the frame, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Alara's old apartment's entire monthly rent. Scar tissue ran from his left eye to his jaw, a permanent reminder of what happened when someone crossed the wrong family. His eyes, dark as winter sky, focused on the child like she was a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. "I am." His voice came low, careful. Most people had never heard Rafael Romano sound careful about anything. "Mama says you helped us." "Thank you." Lily returned to her pancakes without waiting for a response, operating on the absolute logic of childhood that assumed kindness required no explanation. She simply continued eating, occasionally glancing at him with the kind of uncomplicated curiosity that made men like Rafael Romano forget they'd ever killed anyone. He didn't leave. Allara expected him to retreat to his office, to his phone calls and his empire of controlled violence, but instead he moved to the counter and poured himself coffee. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who've already said the hardest things. Lily swallowed and spoke again without looking up. "Do you like pancakes?" "I don't know," he said. "I haven't eaten one in 20 years. "That's a very long time." "It is." Allara turned to face him, watching this moment like it was happening behind glass. Rafael Romano, who'd ordered men executed with a phone call, who'd built an empire on fear and silence, was considering her daughter's pancake recommendation with the same gravity he brought to ordering the destruction of his enemies. "You should try one," Lily said, moving her plate slightly to the side, making room. A gesture of infinite generosity. "There's extra on the stove." "Mama always makes extra." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, Rafael didn't become soft. But something in his chest cracked open just enough to let light through. He looked at Allara for permission, and she nodded, sliding a plate between them. She poured warm syrup while Lily narrated the proper way to eat a pancake with the authority of someone who'd been eating them for exactly 6 years. The following days moved in patterns. Lily would wake early and wander through the penthouse until she found Rafael in his study or his office. She showed him her drawings, stick figures with enormous hands and hair like lightning bolts. She held his scarred hand without hesitation when they walked through the building. She sat beside him during dinner and asked him questions that had no easy answers. "Why is Aunt Ava blind? Do you have a mama? Do you get scared sometimes?" He answered each one like she'd asked him to solve for the meaning of existence. Sergio witnessed it all, standing in doorways, exchanging glances with Sal that said everything. In 15 years of working for Rafael Romano, they had never seen him sit on a couch and let a child fall asleep against his shoulder. They had never seen him carry that child to bed without being asked, moving like he was transporting something infinitely fragile. Sergio watched his boss tuck the blanket carefully around Lily's small form and felt something shift in the foundation of everything he believed about the man who signed his paychecks. That evening, while Allara read to Ava in the living room, performing different character voices, making her laugh, Lily ran into Rafael's office, breathless with discovery. Her latest drawing hung from her small fist like a proclamation. "Mr. Rafael, look! I drew our family." She thrust the paper at him, and he took it with the gravity of someone receiving a treaty. The drawing showed 4 stick figures holding hands, a tall figure with a jagged scar on his face. A smaller figure with Ava's characteristic tilt of her head. "Allara, identifiable by her longer hair and the outline of an apron. And Lily in the center, smaller than everyone, but somehow the point around which the others orbited. They were all connected, hand to hand to hand to hand, standing beneath a sun that looked like it had exploded with joy. Rafael's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. The drawing blurred in front of his eyes because he was remembering everything with sudden, devastating clarity, standing in that warehouse entrance, watching a woman in a stained apron face down 3 men with crowbars, her voice cutting through the thunder like something that refused to break. He'd thought she was brave or stupid. He'd had no idea she was becoming the center around which his entire world would reorganize itself. "It's beautiful," he managed finally. "Where am I?" "There," Lily pointed to the tall figure with the scarred face. "That's you. You're holding my hand. And Mama's hand. You're part of our family now." He looked at his daughter, because in every way that mattered, she was his daughter now, and understood for the first time that family wasn't something you built through loyalty oaths and blood codes. It was something you accepted when a 6-year-old gave you a drawing that said you belonged. That evening, after Lily had been tucked into bed and Ava had retired to her wing with a satisfied smile playing at her lips, Rafael found Allara on the penthouse balcony. The November wind tore through the city like a blade wrapped in ice, but she stood exposed to it, her arms wrapped around herself, the city lights spread below them like someone had scattered diamonds across darkness. "She called me part of your family today," he said quietly. "She drew me into the picture." Allara turned. The wind caught her hair, pulling it across her face. "She's 6. She doesn't understand the complexity of. Maybe she understands better than we do." He stepped closer, careful, offering her the space to retreat if she wanted to. "When my father was murdered, I was 17 years old. I watched it happen from inside a closet. And I told myself that moment that I would never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. I built everything, every operation, every alliance, every show of strength, on that distance. On that control. And then you walked into the rain when you had no weapon, no training, nothing but muscle memory and survival instinct, and you stood between killers and victims without knowing who was watching. Without knowing who I was." His voice deepened, roughened by something he didn't have words for. "You saved my sister. You stepped into my world and didn't run when you saw what I really am. And your daughter," his throat closed. He had to stop, had to breathe through it. "She drew me into your family like I belonged there. Like I could be something other than what I've built myself into." Allara's eyes filled with tears, the wind pulling them across her cheeks. "Do you want to belong there? I don't know how to be what you need. I don't know how to be gentle or safe or normal. I've killed men, Allara. I've built an empire on fear and violence. My hands have done terrible things. But when I look at you, when Lily shows me her drawings, when Ava laughs because you're reading to her in those ridiculous voices, I want to learn. I want to be someone who deserves to be in that drawing. Someone your daughter can hold hands with without knowing she's holding the hands of a killer." She touched his face, and he flinched like he'd forgotten what kindness felt like no one had ever touched him with gentleness before, this woman who'd had nothing but stood with everything. "You already are," she whispered. "You became that person the night you let us in." They stood there in the Chicago wind, 2 people who'd found each other in a thunderstorm and learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the person who stands with you in the rain. Sometimes it's the child who draws you into her pictures. Sometimes it's the sister who feels your heartbeat change when the right person walks into the room. The balcony door opened. Ava emerged, guided by sound alone, her hand reaching forward until it found the railing. She moved with absolute confidence toward them, found both their hands, pulled them together. "I knew you two would figure it out eventually. I'm blind, not oblivious. Now can we please have a proper family dinner where everyone admits they love each other? I'm tired of pretending I can't hear Rafael's heart racing every time Allara walks into a room." 6 months later, Allara and Lily had fully moved into the penthouse. Lily called him Papa Rafi now. Ava was Aunt Ava. The drawings multiplied, pinned across the refrigerator like evidence of a new world being built one stick figure at a time. The predators had been dismantled. Robert Hargrove, the monster who'd tried to use her as leverage, was serving 42 years in federal prison. Victoria Ashford received life without parole, her empire scattered like ashes. Connor Ashford's trial had made national news, 2 weeks of testimony about corruption that ran so deep it took down entire political networks. He would die in prison. They all would. Allara refused to become the boss's wife. She insisted on making her own way, managing the non-profit Rafael funded that helped single mothers get job training and childcare. She walked into that office every morning with the same courage she'd walked into that rainstorm with, knowing she was building something real, something that would protect other women the way she hadn't been protected. Rafael learned to leave his guns at the door. He learned to read bedtime stories, his deep voice bringing fairy tales to life while Lily fell asleep against his shoulder. He learned to be present without controlling, to trust without walls. Final family dinner in the penthouse. Lily showed everyone her latest drawing, no longer crude stick figures but something more detailed, more real. Their family of 4 holding hands. Below it, written in careful letters that showed the concentration of a 6-year-old who was learning to claim her world with words, our family. Rafael looked at that drawing and remembered standing in the warehouse entrance, watching a stranger in a stained apron face down killers in the rain. He'd thought she was brave or stupid. Now he knew she was something else entirely. She was exactly what they all needed, appearing at exactly the right moment. A reminder that courage isn't about power or control. It's about choosing to act when everything in you says run. Allara held Lily close and thought about that night on Halstead Street, how she was just trying to survive until the next shift, the next tip, the next bill payment. How she had no idea that stepping into the rain would lead here. To this family she never imagined. To this man who learned gentleness from her daughter's drawings. To this life where being brave enough to care led to everything. The city lights spread below them like scattered diamonds. For people in a high place, together. A family built on choice rather than blood. Built on the night a woman with $34 in her pocket decided that some things were worth more than safety. Every day we choose between fear and trust, between closing ourselves off and opening our hearts. She chose to step into the rain when she had every reason to run. He chose to let them in when he'd built his entire life on walls. They both learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about recognizing the people who will stand with you in the storm, who will be brave enough to be vulnerable, who will draw you into their pictures even when you think you don't belong. If this story moved you, prove it. Drop a like right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications because tomorrow's story will break your heart and put it back together. Comment below, what would you do if you saw someone in danger? Would you run or would you stand? Share this video with someone who needs to hear that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting anyway. I'll see you in the next one.